it wasn't as scary 20 years ago as it is now. And that's not because the science has changed very much. It's that we're 20 years closer to the cliff. The thing is, as you say, there's a lot of hypotheticals. We don't know where the cliff is. We don't know when humanity falls off this cliff, when it becomes overwhelming, when it becomes more than we can handle. We don't know. But we know it's there, right? We know there's some amount of climate change that we can't handle. And we know that we're changing the climate faster and faster. And so we're a lot closer to the cliff than we were. So in some sense, even though we don't know exactly what's going to happen, we know that the bad stuff is getting closer.
This time on 20 Minutes into the Future, climate scientist Michael Tobis speaks with John Lebkowski and Scoop Sweeney in a wide-ranging interview about climate change and sustainability.
Welcome to the Plutopia News Network. Our guest today is climate scientist Michael Tobis, founder of the planet3.org website. Michael has deep knowledge of climate science and has spent many years advocating a clear understanding of the problem and potential solutions for global climate change. So, Michael,
Yes,
tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get into climate science?
Well, there's a long version and a super long version. I was interested in, I had a degree. I had a couple degrees in engineering, and I kind of got bored with being a double E. And I was trying to figure out what I could do with my talents that would be sort of socially more in the public interest and not just in the interest of my employer. And this was in the late 80s, and I read an article in Scientific American by the renowned late Stephen Schneider, who basically was talking about how computers are contributing to climate science. And I said, well, that's for me. I get to play with computers, I get to do math, and I get to do something that's sort of in the general interest in terms of the environment. But I also had this other motivation, which was I was interested in how people make decisions collectively, and how it is that complicated information gets into the way we design our society, and how we would process this information as it became more and more public. And I was not prepared for the answer that we saw, which was that we completely failed to take account for it and are acting as if it's not happening at all. Now, it's less true lately. There's been a lot of talk. There's been a lot of media coverage, and there's been a lot of argument. But in terms of actually taking the bull by the horns and dealing with this situation, we are way, way behind where we rationally would have been if we were paying attention.
Well, is it really a question of attention, or is it a question of obfuscation? Well,
that's kind of what I'm wanting to talk about here, is that there's deliberate obfuscation. There are forces that are deliberately trying to confuse and sort of mute the message that's coming pretty clearly from the evidence. And I don't want to put on this sort of authoritative hat and say, I am science and this is true. But the evidence is really, if you know what you're doing and you know what's going on, the evidence is very compelling that we not only have to cut down on carbon emissions, we eventually have to stop, and eventually is not that far in the future anymore. Or else we'll leave the world in a completely disrupted situation, and it's probably not a good idea to do that.
Well, you recently tweeted that the purpose of journalism seems to be to prevaricate, which is sort of like saying fake news, right?
Not exactly. I think what I meant by prevaricate, I don't even know if I used the exact right word. What I meant was that they do on the one hand this, on the other hand that. So they report truly on what people are saying. They said, this person said that, and that's a true thing. This other person said that, that's a true thing. But they refuse to weigh which of these two people if either knows what they're talking about. Now, sometimes the truth actually does lie in between, and that's a good heuristic for a lot of people. But sometimes one of these people is completely full of it, and I think should be the job of journalism to say, okay, this guy's got his head screwed on, right, and this guy doesn't, and they won't do it. That's what I mean by prevaricate. They refuse to take on that mission.
Michael, one of the things I saw in one of your articles in Medium.com referred to the media concentrating more on what's sexy rather than what is really important. Can you expound on that?
Yeah, well, they're in the entertainment business. They're trying to sell soap. They're trying to sell ads, and they're trying to give people what they want. The First Amendment right to a free press is not there so that the press can sell you soap. It's there so that they can give you the information you need to be an active participant in a democratic process. And the business structure of the media is such that they're after eyeballs, they're after attention. The conventional media and the new media are the same. They want your attention. They don't want to inform you. If they inform you as a side effect, they don't care. But if they don't, they also don't care. And so it's just a form of entertainment. It's not actually performing the function that we need it to help us manage the increasingly complicated world that we've created for ourselves.
Well, this problem of the climate change debate being more of a debate than it should be makes me think about Murray Hamilton in Jaws. I'm sure you probably saw Jaws, and you remember Murray.
I don't remember this.
Murray Hamilton is the guy who played the mayor of the town, right? And he's absolutely in denial about the existence of this shark, and he won't do anything about it until a few people have become, shark food.
Because
because it's of the economic impact.
Right.
And I think that's what we're seeing.
Oh, absolutely. And if you go to coastal areas, including Galveston, Miami, North Carolina, the real estate business is bound and determined to completely deny that there's any sea level rise trend, because that just chews up their property values, and nobody who actually owns property at sea level wants to hear it. So there's this big motivator for the people who are most affected to be the ones who are denying it, because they need to maintain their value.
That would include lots of that going on. That would include President Trump, who owns quite a bit of that property, wouldn't it?
I am carefully not discussing President Trump. So
that's may already be underwater.
I will leave that to you. There does seem to be, he does have some property in Florida at sea level.
Yeah. Well, so you created your graph of sort of a graph of the information ecosystem around this topic, and the graph, which we'll add to the webpage when
Sure.
we add this talk. It suggests that the debate in the popular press is sort of missing the point. But what are the kinds of things that journalists are getting wrong?
Well, the graph is something I drew a while ago. So I think that the ignoring the wild-eyed voices of alarmism is no longer as true as it was. I think at this point you're seeing the press really focusing on both extremes of what's going on, and they'll swing back and forth from absolutely nothing's happening and it's all just a hoax to, on the other hand, this idea that we're doomed and there's nothing left we can do, and in 10 or 15 years we'll all be underwater anyway, so why bother? They're not really, I think there's a couple things that I think people miss. But one of them is that this is a real science. It's not a bunch of people with opinions. It's not just a bunch of nerds collecting data. And no offense to nerds collecting data. I love nerds and I love data. But there's more to it than that. The Earth is an object in space, and it's subject to the laws of physics. And there's no fundamental reason why you can't apply physics to this problem. And since it's probably, in my opinion, it's the most interesting physical problem that there is, some people will take an interest in it. And some of those people will be really, really smart. I have to say, some of them are much, much, much smarter than I am. And I don't think I'm particularly a slouch, but these guys are really good. And I don't think the world understands that. And, you know, they put it in, oh, experts always get this wrong and always get that wrong. Compare it with, you know, what economists or I don't know, all sorts of other sociologists, other places where there are experts. And the thing is, those experts have a much harder problem because they're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with a physical system. And we can understand the physical system. We can put constraints on it. We can test our beliefs. And it all holds together really solidly. So that's one thing people miss. And they miss that it's a real science.
Well, I spoke once with a scientist at the University of Colorado about this problem for an article I wrote several years ago. And he sort of made the point, he said that, you know, as scientists, you're talking about hypotheticals, you know, and you're going to be reluctant to say that something is absolutely true. You talk more about the preponderance of evidence and scenarios and what the possibilities are. And he said that he felt that created some difficulty in sort of making the point that this is really, that there's a huge risk here, because scientists, at least initially, were a little bit reluctant to put themselves out there, though since then, you know, that's changed quite a bit. But still, early on, that made it easy to say, well, it's not a decided thing. It's not.
You know, and there's another thing that ties into that is like, it wasn't as scary 20 years ago as it is now. And that's not because the science has changed very much. It's that we're 20 years closer to the cliff. You know, the thing is, you know, as you say, there's a lot of hypotheticals. We don't know where the cliff is. We don't know when humanity falls off this cliff, when it becomes overwhelming, when it becomes more than we can handle. We don't know. But we know it's there, right? We know there's some amount of climate change that we can't handle. And we know that we're changing the climate faster and faster. And so we're a lot closer to the cliff than we were. So in some sense, even though we don't know exactly what's going to happen, we know that the bad stuff is getting closer. And so you can use stronger words now because it's closer. It's less ambiguous.
I think it's more common for the people who contest anthropogenic climate change to say now, okay, the climate is changing, we'll give you that, but it's not because of anything that we're doing, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Okay,
right?
So this is another thing that people don't get. People don't get the extent to which what has happened was actually predicted. So my answer to that one is always, let's go back to 1979. So in the 70s, people were starting to talk about this. And notoriously, there were some people who said, oh, it's going to be an ice age that humans create. And other people said, oh, it's going to be a hothouse that humans create. And other people said, oh, I don't think we can do anything. Well, so the LBJ called together a blue ribbon commission and said, well, is this real or not? And he went to the fellow who had launched the first weather satellite, a man named by the name of Vern Sumi, who I had the privilege of meeting in his final days. Vern pulled together this blue ribbon commission, and this was long before it was politicized. And he basically got the biggest, smartest guys in meteorology and planetary physics and oceanography and sat them in a room. And they released a report in 1979 that said what they thought was going to happen. And they freaking nailed it. They got it right. They said it's going to start to be obvious around the turn of the century. They said that we don't see any reason that it should be small or benign. And they also said two things that you would not have predicted if you didn't know what you were talking about. Thing number one, there would be more effect in the polar regions than in the equatorial regions. And thing number two, that while the surface would warm, the stratosphere would cool. Nobody talks about the cooling stratosphere because nobody lives in this cooling stratosphere. But this is a fingerprint that they got right in 1979. And there's a lot more to this thing, and you have to dig to find it, but it's on the internet. It's called the Charney Report, Charney. And you can dig it up, and it's in fairly plain language. It's not too inaccessible, and pretty much says what's going to happen. And they got it right. And this came out with a stamp of the National Academy of Sciences. And since then, what's been coming out of the IPCC and all of that, there's been a lot more elaboration. There's been a lot more study of various kinds. But the conclusions of the Charney Commission have not been changed. They got it right. And so to say, okay, we don't know what's causing this, is to ignore the fact that we said this was going to happen. And that bit of history is busily being erased. They hate that bit of history, and they focus on the two or three guys who talk about global cooling, but they don't look at what the Blue Ribbon Commission said or what the scientific community has been saying ever since 1979, which has turned out, right? It's actually what we see. So that's another thing people don't know. People don't know that the climate community already said what was going to happen long before it happened. In fact, in the 70s, it was a cold period. Nobody had any reason to predict this warming trend other than that there was physics behind it.
Michael, I have a question about your article, Who Decides What is True? And you talk about zombie arguments, and that seems to play into what you were talking about.
Absolutely.
What is a zombie argument? And give us some examples.
Oh, I just did give you an example, the example that, global cooling was predicted in the 70s. Well, a couple people did predict that. But on the whole, that was not what the scientific community was saying. And it was not what the people who were actually the leaders of the scientific community were saying. So that would be an example of one. Another one is, the sun is responsible for the heating we're seeing. Well, there's been no trend in solar output. There's been a decrease in sunspots, and some people are trying to hand wave about that. But if you actually line them up, that's not there. Let's see, what other ones are there? There's a whole website called Skeptical Science, which is dedicated to collecting these arguments and rebutting them. Unfortunately for me, that it's like what's popping to my mind is the best arguments they have, but they're not very good. So there was an ice age in the Ordovician that doesn't seem to have a correlation to CO2, or I was very, very deep in time, and we don't really know what's happened. We don't have solid evidence. There's that. There are other causes for climate change. Well, yes, we know that. Not like we haven't figured that out. They keep wheeling this stuff out. And of course, the big one, which is that climate scientists are in it for the money, which is completely ridiculous, right? Because, well, in my case, I never made a decent salary out of this stuff in my life. I'm still talking about it. It's true that some people are making money on wind turbines and solar panels, but that isn't the scientific community that's doing that. It's not a motivation for us to lie. And if somebody was going to bribe us, the oil industry has a lot more money than the wind industry still. So it doesn't really make sense that we'd be doing it for the money. There's no money to be doing it for. Then they turn around and say, well, you get grants by telling the government what they want. Well, this is absolutely crazy. No politician wants this news. No politician wants to tell people they can't drive their cars. No politician wants to tell people they can't heat their houses, or in your case, cool them. Nobody wants to do that. And so the motivational structure doesn't make any sense. And that's when we see all the time it's about the money. And there just isn't any money in believing this stuff. If there was, things probably would have gone further than they have. We're just a cost sector, right? We're just adding problems to people in the short run because we want them to avoid problems in the long run. And that, there's no money in that.
I always thought this issue was politicized more than it should have been, partly because of the Al Gore thing. Al Gore, for very good reasons, threw a lot of weight behind the climate change question and issue, and he had his film about that, and that made it into, in some people's minds, you could point to that and say it was just some kind of left-wing conspiracy theory.
Yeah, it's possible that Mr. Gore was the wrong voice for all of this, but this stuff's happening in other countries too, and so I couldn't lay it all on his feet. I mean, I've met a few people who just basically had one or two classes at university and got the message, and it changed what they think is the right thing to do for the rest of their lives. And Gore was one of them, and I can't fault him for it. But yeah, a lot of people don't like him, and I don't know what he's supposed to do about that. But in other countries, I run into the same kind of denial, but I don't hear Al Gore in the first sentence.
It seems that other countries, though, are taking steps that they're, you have the countries that signed the Paris Accord, and globally there seems to be a reduction in the amount of fossil fuels that are actually being used, or a trend away from complete focus on fossil fuels as a source of energy.
You've hit two things that I feel a need to elaborate on. One is the Paris Agreement, and I've always been a skeptic about it. But the other is, is the trend good? And in fact, the only way in which the trend is good is in terms of the amount of economic activity per unit of carbon. Okay, so there's this measure that people have come up with. It's called carbon intensity. And the carbon intensity of the world economy is coming down slightly, which means you need a little bit less emissions to make a certain amount of money. But it's not keeping up with growth. And what the climate system actually cares about is not just how much carbon is being put out, but how much carbon has ever been put out. So it doesn't go away. Any carbon you put into the system stays there. But even that is sort of, if you actually look at the annual emissions, they're still going up. Year over year, we're still going up. We're not going up as fast as we were. And that's the only good news. But in fact, until we get carbon emissions to a level that's close enough to zero to not matter, things are going to keep getting worse.
Isn't it true that if we reduced carbon emissions to zero, we would still have like methane coming out of the ocean? Or
there's some knock-on effects, but we've already bought those. So yeah, there's that. The thing about the methane that's under the ocean, that has a time scale of probably thousands of years. So yeah, there's all sorts of science fiction to be written about that. But our immediate problem is to we're in a hole and we should stop digging. And the answer we get back is, oh, we're not digging as fast as we used to be. But we're still getting deeper, right? We're still getting deeper in the hole. Maybe not as fast as we were, but we're still getting deeper. And until we stop emitting altogether, the problem's going to get worse. And it's really a hard sell. It's a really hard sell, because when I start telling people things like, I did a talk in Austin actually it was at the Austin Forum just before they started promoting it. So I didn't get a huge turnout, but there I was, and I said, the United States has to reduce carbon emissions. I basically made the whole argument. I did charts and graphs, and I came up with, if we're really generous to the United States, by 2050, we'll have to do an 80% cut in emissions to stay below 2 degrees C. And the audience actually laughed in my face. I mean, it was perhaps the most embarrassing public talk I ever did, because people thought people were with me until that moment. And at that moment, they thought I was completely being ridiculous. And nevertheless, that's the fact. 80% cut by 2050 is pretty much what we're talking about to stay roughly in bounds with the Paris Treaty. And that's generous to the U.S. So
yeah, that makes extinction sound a little more likely.
It does, doesn't it?
Michael, you've talked about... oh, sorry.
There was a time when I would have said that there was some hope that we could distribute the right kind of information over the internet and reach people, and this would be a way to get more people on board and facilitate a greater understanding of this problem. But now the internet, it's like we've screwed the pooch with the internet.
Didn't we, though?
It's become a petri dish for toxic propaganda. And
it has.
I figure out, I wonder if there's some way around that. Can we?
So yeah, okay. So here's the thing, like Facebook, people are worried about AI and the machines, malign machines that don't care about life taking over the world. But I think we already have one. Facebook is an out of control artificial intelligence, and its motivation is to produce bullshit. The more, and they're trying, I have to give them credit for trying the last few months, but it's a bit late, and nobody, nobody really is, I lost my train of thought here. You're going to edit this out, right?
Yeah.
Facebook is an AI that's intended to get people engaged with Facebook. It's a nice, simple optimization problem. They have huge amounts of data, and that's all it is. So the fact that bullshit rises to the top in this universe, in retrospect, is not surprising. In retrospect, that makes sense. What people need is an information source that's not profit-driven. And, I thought when the internet started going to an advertising model that was when we screwed the pooch. That was the moment that we lost control of this thing. Because I wasn't expecting the AI hook, but it just seemed to me that once you start making it pay for itself through third parties, you've got a problem. And you really want the people producing the information, the people consuming the information, to be in a relationship with each other without a third party trying to manipulate it. And I don't see what value Facebook adds at all. I would like to see an internet with no Facebook. And I would like to see Google somehow in the public domain. I think we should all pitch in and buy it. So yeah, we should own Google. Google shouldn't own us. And Facebook, I don't see the point. We could have done all of that with RSS if we just set our minds to it. And they just kind of cut us off and made this monster. And Now it's just force of habit with people to look at Facebook. It is with me. I look at it every day, but it's not doing us any good because it's got no quality control on it. And yeah, they're trying, but their motivation is still eyeballs. So,
Michael, change a bit of the subject. There's a lot of talk currently about tariffs. You've written about carbon tariffs. Can you
not much, but okay, I'll try.
Well, I was just reading your article where you talked about the economic explosion in Asia and how if we had had carbon tariffs, it might have been slowed down. They would have still progressed, but just not as violently as they have. Is that a real thing, or is it just something?
Oh yeah. I remember this sentence you're talking about now. It wasn't core to my argument, and what I was saying mostly was, if we had taken it serious. This is really about the Kyoto Protocol. This is what this is all about. It's like we understood in the 90s what we had to do, and a political compromise was reached where in the West, basically the NATO countries and Japan and Australia, a couple others, but basically advanced countries would start first, and then they would show everybody else it was possible, and then everybody else would come along. Well, a lot of people said this is too big of an advantage for China, and they wouldn't go along with it. And the U.S. Senate was not touching this treaty. So the United States never signed it, even though Al Gore was vice president at the time. I imagine he was pulling for it. I think the Senate was like 97-3 against it. And so if we had actually done what most countries agreed to, which left the ball in the hands of the West for the first round, maybe the history of China would have been different. But the thing I was expressing, like, I don't know, I'm not an economist. It's not my bailiwick. But I think that we had the right intentions, we had the right numbers in mind. And if we had started in the 90s and not the 2020s, I mean, we're really now looking at a 30-year delay. The outcomes are just a lot worse now. And at this point, all the people who understand the science pretty well think we're going to have pain. We're not going to avoid it.
There is a tendency in media, just kind of in general, to report on extreme weather events as though they were just weather without bringing climate into it. Is that another part of the problem?
I'm kind of in the middle on this one. I actually started writing a book about it, and I may have quit because I don't think it has an audience. Because I really am in the middle. You can't look at an individual weather event and say, this is because of climate change or this isn't because of climate change. But if you have like you're having down there, weeks on end of it, being really bad August weather in July, that starts to be, okay, that's a little more than an event, that's a pattern. Then you look at the same thing happening in California and in Algeria and in Sweden and in England and in Japan, all of which has happened in the last month. Now you're starting to see, well, this pattern is everywhere. There's been extreme heat in lots of places. There was even extreme heat here in Canada. So the pattern has been. The entire Northern Hemisphere has had hot spots of extreme degree in the last month. So that's a different kind of a situation. So some things are like, yeah, we can pin that on climate change. Some things aren't. Harvey, the hurricane that hit Houston, people played the climate change angle really hard on that. And I was not convinced, right? It was not an intense hurricane. It just happened not to move very far. And so you'd have to make a case that slow moving tropical storms are a factor of climate change. And I never heard anybody talk about that before. So are you just making that up? We don't know. So it's a hard one. It's a hard one. You don't always know with an individual event whether you would have had a worse event if there wasn't climate change. There's always been weird things happening in the atmosphere. But on the other hand, July of 2018 has been a different picture for me. I say on this one, you really see a climate change footprint. You're really seeing stuff going on this month on a global scale that are odd, that you wouldn't have expected, each individual place pushing a record is not a big deal. Records have to be set. They wouldn't be a record if they weren't set. But for places all around the world to set records in the same month is pretty strange.
Yeah, I was surprised to find the Sahara Desert in the air outside my house here in Texas.
Oh, and that does happen. You occasionally get these dust plumes. But yeah, that's pretty intense too. Interesting thing that if you have a lot of Sahara dust, you suppress hurricanes. So maybe you want to call that good news. I don't know.
Oh, that's interesting. You launched a science-informed sustainability journalism site called Planet 3. What's happening with that site?
I failed, and I'm thinking about restarting. So this has to go back to the story of when I was in the eye of Sauron, when the right-wing press decided that Michael Tobis was the villain of the week. I was on Glenn Beck. I think I might have told you this once. I was the villain of the day on Glenn Beck when he was still on television. Senator Inhofe of Oklahoma released press releases saying that there was this bad scientist who was saying bad things. I won't get into the details. I can talk about this incident forever. But I got some attention, and I said, well, what am I going to do with this attention? And I tried to resolve these problems that I'm talking about by saying, okay, we need scientists ourselves to be able to communicate. We need a communication nexus for people who know what they're talking about. And maybe we could get some credibility in the world. And so I tried to pull together a bunch of climate bloggers. I had some momentum at the beginning, but I was the main motive force. And trying to hold down a job and dealing with my father's last days. And I was tapped out. I couldn't do it. So it fizzled. Basically, I told people, well, the worst case is it becomes my blog. And then it became my blog, and then I lost interest. So if you look at the early articles on Planet 3, you'll see quite a variety of interesting voices. And then it gradually turned into a reboot of my blog. And then eventually I stopped posting. The last few things I've posted have been on Medium. And I try to edit a little more carefully now. I used to be very sloppy and very wordy too. So actually I think Twitter has improved my writing. So there's a question of whether I want to be the writer or I want to be the motive force in this. But I think somebody ought to do it. And so I'm considering a reboot, but at the moment it's pretty much just sitting there taking up space on the internet. Haven't done much with it in a couple of years.
If you did a reboot, what would you see as the mission for the new site?
My mission has always been the same. Is I want there to be something that people who aren't experts could read, but they're people who are sort of find what they're reading in the popular press insufficient, not enough detail, and really not enough honesty, right? Not enough on the one hand this, on the other hand that. One of the things that when I was a blogger, in I guess just before I did Planet 3, I was a fairly dedicated blogger. And I got some pretty interesting conversations going. And there are still interesting conversations that go on in the climate blog world. You have to dig for them. There's a lot of crap out there, but there's a few sites that habitually have really interesting conversations. And, there's this idea of political discourse. There's this idea of a give and take of ideas. There's this idea that together we could be smarter than any of us individually. And in today's, it's not just polarized. It's sort of like it's turned into a game, right? We're posturing. We're not talking. There's no real discussion. You look at congresses and parliaments and so on. This idea of debate has always been fake, right? Nobody ever listens to what the other party says in these so-called parliamentary debates. It's nonsense. Nobody ever listens. But the rest of us have started acting like that. The rest of us have sort of staked out a position, and you think the conversation is defending our position, instead of like digging around and finding out what's wrong with your position and trying to improve it, and listening to people who disagree with you and trying to find common ground. And scientists still do that because that's what science is. So in a way, I think I'd like scientists to model the kind of discussion that we've lost, where we really don't come into a discussion with our whole position laid out, where we're actually interested in learning. And so that's like the big hand wavy. There's some technical things I want to do. One is the contributor of the article should be the moderator of the comment. If you don't have time to moderate the comments, I don't want your article. You can delegate it. You can say, I'm writing the article and this person here is my delegated moderator. But you cannot just leave it to someone who isn't invested in the article to make the conversation work. And so I don't think that's ever been tried, and I would like to try that.
Sounds like you're trying to avoid drive-by journalism, which seems to be the flavor of the year or of the decade.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's what I'm trying to say is it's been very frustrating having a fairly simple, straightforward message. I mean, it's not that complicated, but the press has been unable to deliver it to people. And it's partly because there's the he said, she said, and the other guys are saying a bunch of things that don't make sense. And it's partly that the press isn't invested in this topic at all. In fact, there was somebody, Chris Hayes, is that the guy's name? He's fairly well-known journalist.
That's correct.
I don't know who he is, but I guess.
From MSNBC, right?
MSNBC. He tweeted today that he said, well, I'm interested personally in climate change, but my producers don't want it because it kills our ratings.
And it also kills your advertisers. That's what they're not saying.
Your ratings, people don't watch. People don't want that news. And so, what are we going to do? There is stuff that needs to be done in response to the situation that we've created for ourselves. And nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to hear about it. I mean, I a lot of times when I'm at a party and, people don't know who I am, and they ask me, what do you do? Well, now I just say I'm a software developer. That's easy. But when I was actually a paid scientist, I would sometimes say I'm a geophysicist and let them think I was in the oil industry, because I didn't want to get into suddenly going into my scary rants in the middle of a party. I went to the party to have a good time, not to have a scary rant. One time, one guy asked me point blank what I did, and I said, well, I study climate science. And he looked at me and he said, oh man, that's a real buzzkill. And he walked away. Not another word.
Wow. That's kind of interesting.
It was interesting.
And I think it's quite common. Just no thanks to a lot of the media figures that continually attack anyone that wants to talk about climate change.
Yeah, we're not allowed to talk about it. But there are reasons to not talk about it because it is grim. And the less we talk about it, the grimmer it gets. That's the other side of it. But you get punished for it, and you get punished for having it as your main interest. So, part of me just wants to run away and not do any of this. But I'm so habituated at this point, it looks like I'm going to keep doing it anyway, whether I want to or not.
I think about how so many of us were raised on those like 50s B movies where the scientist was a heroic figure, right, and commanded huge respect, and that, maybe we need some more of that kind of propaganda.
Yeah, that's interesting. But there were always like the good guy scientists and the bad guy scientists, and there was, they never really portrayed the hardworking geek scientist, which is, the real world. There was, the bad guy scientist has some scheme to do something evil, and the good guy scientist wants to stop the bad guy scientist, or stuff like that. Jurassic Park is a perfect example.
Yeah.
It strikes
but in
me.
Jurassic Park, the kid breaks into this highly secure system by guessing a password, right? Nobody really wants to know how much work it is to break into that system. Nobody really wants to know how much work it is to create a dinosaur from genetic material. It's actually not that much fun being a scientist. It's really, you have to be obsessed with the material that you're studying. You have to really be focused on it, and that makes for bad movies. Bad movies. So I understand you're talking about, well, can we make a scientist hero? But this isn't about science. This is really, the science is delivered. It's signed, sealed, and delivered. If we hadn't learned a thing since 1979, since the Charney Report, we'd still know what to do. And I'm all for science. I'm all for climate science. It's an interesting field. The problems have nothing to do with us. The problems have to do with getting the message across to everybody else that we have a real problem, and it's getting more and more urgent with each passing year. But it's not us. It's like we have to pick up this ball. The reason for the idea of Planet 3 is we have to do this because the journalists aren't doing it. And the liberal arts people aren't doing it either. I mean, there are people who study science as a social discipline and so on, but they're just like the journalists. They refuse to take sides. And so right and wrong don't seem to matter anymore. It's just left and right. And we get classified with the left, and other scientific disciplines get classified with the right. But we're just trying to get the information out there.
I did see an article in Fortune, just within the last day or so, that said that there's a Republican proposal to establish a fee of $24 a ton on carbon dioxide emissions that's intended to be a response to climate change. And it probably won't pass, and it isn't really a big deal, but it was kind of interesting to see a Republican making that kind of proposal, because Republicans have traditionally been more on the climate denier side.
Well, I think one part of that story is that the guy who proposed that was from South Florida, and in a purple district. But that's always been the pitch of this group called Citizens Climate Lobby, is that try to get Republicans on board by pulling together sort of a market-oriented approach, not regulatory, but fiscal and all this stuff. And like I said, I've left the United States, and I don't want to comment too much on American politics, but that's the idea. of it. And I'm sort of skeptical that will sell among rural populations, where most of the people who vote for the right these days, and this in other countries too, because they're the ones who get hit hardest by carbon tax, right? People who drive around constantly, right, and who love their big trucks. Those are the guys who are going to get hit hardest by carbon tax, and they tend to have sprawling houses with bad insulation.
Yeah, I mean, a real mitigation of this problem would be would drive substantial lifestyle change that I'm sure nobody's quite ready for.
Right, but it hits rural people way harder than it hits urban people. It's a really unfortunate side effect of the way the world is put together. Is that the lifestyle change in the city is okay. Well, we'll build some train tracks. We'll have some electric Ubers. We can adapt. But if you have the 4x4 and the ranch, and the cattle, I suppose, it's a thing. It's a big deal. You're gonna have to change everything. So that's like one problem with it that I just don't have a good idea of how to get a handle on. It really does. I should not say this, but the fact is, if you deal with it with a carbon tax alone, it really does transfer wealth from the rural areas to the urban areas. And it's hard for me to imagine that the party that represents rural interests is going to be very excited about that.
It strikes me that the national attitude these days is like the old cliche of everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die.
Yeah, yeah, that's it. Or I had a tweet that did pretty well last week, or a few weeks ago. Almost everything has to decarbonize, but the thing which I'm doing is an exception. And I put a hashtag on thing which I'm doing. So it's basically everybody wants everybody else to do it. And they have some excuse that it's not them, it's somebody else. Scientists fly around a lot. And they go to conferences on various continents and go to expensive hotels. And, for scientists to get in a plane 8-10 times a year for round trip, not unusual. And if you actually look at the carbon impact, there's probably no lifestyle that does more damage than flying every month.
Well, I guess we've sort of reached the end of our time. The last question I would ask you is, do you think there's any hope for the human race?
Huh. I'm in a grim mood these days.
Yeah, I noticed.
There's nothing technically stopping us from dealing with this. There's nothing that prevents us from having comfortable, sustainable lives on the earth. There's nothing that prevents us from reducing the losses. There are already losses. There's already stuff we've lost in the environment, and there's going to be more, and I don't think there's any avoiding that. So I can't give a totally happy message there. There's no happily ever after. There are some problems coming. But if we took the bull by the horns, we could deal with it. We could get out of this without too much trouble, and we could get to a place that was happy and free. Do I think we're going to do that? I was never the most optimistic person in the world, but at the moment, I don't think the trends look good. And the thing, I guess one thing that I would like to say, if this is like going to be, the sum total of what I say is another piece that people are missing is the immense refugee problem that we bought ourselves. Just in Bangladesh, which is a country that's overpopulated, which is an interesting story, part the Green Revolution. They put their Green Revolution dividend into multiplying, just like bacteria. So they overpopulated their country. But it's a low-lying country. It's like Louisiana. It's like Louisiana with 150 million people in it. And when the sea level rises, they're not going to have anywhere to go. And that's just them. There's also Bangkok and Shanghai, and there's all these people who are going to have to relocate. And some of them will be in small countries that they don't have anywhere to relocate to. All the people on the little islands will have to go somewhere. And the trend right now is just and it was really driven, I think, by the Syria crisis, which itself might be climate related. But you have 1 million Syrians running around the world looking for a place to live. And the American solution was just to slam the door shut. Canadians are letting in quite a few Syrians, but it causes problems. This is causing all sorts of reversion to right-wing nationalist politics in Europe. And that's just with 1 million people. We're talking about 100 million from Bangladesh alone who will have to relocate. And I just don't see the world as it's currently put together able to deal with that. And it causes me pain to think about the whole situation, but mostly it causes me pain to think about the people who are going to be landless, homeless, countryless because of this. And it's going to happen gradually, but at this point, I don't see how we can stop it. And if we were better people and we had better systems and we had ways in which the world would cooperate, maybe we could deal with this. But that's my biggest worry. That's my biggest worry.
Learn more about Michael Tobis at initforthegold.blogspot.com and planet3.org. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney, and this is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.